Okay, so today I decided I wanted to show how I keep my superworms and mealworms for breeding to feed my reptiles and my amphibians in my house. I wanted to discuss how you can prevent grain mites and what you can do if you get grain mites. As many of you may know, grain mites are a very big problem in mealworm and superworm colonies and cultures. They get everywhere, they infect everything, they're really creepy to look at. And when I had a really bad infestation of grain mites, I actually was not finding any or many babies at all in either my mealworm or my superworm colony. So I believe that possibly grain mites actually destroy or kill the eggs. It could also just be the fact that there's too high of a humidity for the mealworms or the superworms, and that happens to be rotting out or killing the eggs. But aside from the fact that it does cause significant impact and death and problems in the breeding colony, grain mites also infect everything with grain in it. So that means anything with flour in your house. So that means pasta, bread, practically almost everything that you find in the kitchen nowadays. It has corn or wheat or flour or some kind of grain in it. So you don't want to get this grain mites all throughout your house, especially not in your kitchen. So I wanted to show how that I personally keep them, my colonies. I want to discuss the steps that I take for preventing grain mites and just kind of let you know what you can do if you get grain mites. Unfortunately, if you get grain mites, it usually means you have to kill your entire superworm and mealworm colony. If you get them in your kitchen, you got to throw out almost everything in your kitchen and bomb the kitchen with like a bug killer bomb. So just try not to get grain mites. It's bottom line. But all right, let me show you my breeding bins, which are right in front of us here. But these are my breeding bins. These are actually pretty big containers here, as you can see by the size of my hand. And the top one here is mealworms, and the bottom one here is my superworms. And I do have them stacked on top of each other, but I can get a finger up underneath there, so there's still airflow because of the size getting underneath to the other bin, which is why I don't have these bins set, exactly like this. I actually have them skewed so that airflow is still getting to the bottom bin. This is a smaller breeding arrangement that I have here. Most people choose to use the big plastic drawer storage containers, and then they move their beetles from bin to bin, which prevents the beetles from eating the very young babies, which it's great, it works, but I didn't need anything that big, nor do I have the room to put that, so I'm just doing the containers. And even though these are containers, it's smaller than what most people use. As I said, they're pretty big. They're still fairly big. And they're pretty good for a good sized colony. I can keep quite a bit in here. But as you can see from looking at these bins, I do not have a whole lot of oatmeal or medium substrate. The oatmeal and whatnot only goes about as deep as my thumbnail. So you don't need a lot of oatmeal or wheat bran, and that's a big mistake that a lot of people do, is they'll take a container the size, they'll fill it halfway up with oatmeal or wheat bran. I confess I was one of those people at one time. But you don't need that much oatmeal or that wheat bran, because what happens is if you got too deep of a substrate layer, that gives more room for moisture and humidity to get trapped underneath your oatmeal or in between the oatmeal. So you don't need much, only about half an inch to an inch of oatmeal or wheat bran or whatever food source / medium you are using is all that you need. Now another big factor and why people get grain mites, as I just mentioned, is the buildup of humidity or the holding of moisture in the oatmeal or the wheat bran. Grain mites need a very high humidity in order for their eggs to hatch and for them to breed and thrive and survive. Superworms and mealworms are native to desert environments, so they do not need high humidity. They need a water source or, a moisture source, which we can just, do like we did for crickets or something, give them some veggies and they're fine, but they do not need any kind of humidity much at all in their containers. So in order to keep your humidity low, as I said, step one, don't use too much substrate to trap in that humidity or that moisture, but you also need tons and tons and tons of ventilation. More ventilation is better than not enough. So with my containers here, my entire lid is plastic screening. This plastic screening is also called plastic canvas, and you can get it really cheap. It's about $1. In any craft store, you'll find it with the yarn and the sewing crafts. And for a sheet, bigger than computer paper, it's only $1. It comes in tons of colors if you want to get fancy. But all I did was I cut out a hole, which is almost the entire size of my lid, and then I cut the plastic screen slightly bigger than the hole, and then it is glued on the underside with hot glue. And I have it along the entire edge. There is not a single spot where there is not hot glue on the edge or the border of this screen, so that there's no possibility of a beetle or a worm getting up there and then slipping out underneath one of the sides or of it. Though ideally you don't want your worms or your beetles reaching your screen or your top at all. But it's perfectly, since hot glue is just melted plastic, it's safe to use in your pet reptiles' cages and everything. Is a fun little trick. But you want as much of your lid to be a screened airflow as possible. And make sure when you're stacking containers, I like the long containers, don't use round containers, don't use square containers. That way you can stack them going different directions, one vertical and one horizontal, and that way you're getting airflow underneath. And you're still saving the space because you don't need to put them side by side as you would with a square container in order to allow airflow. Aside from the screen lid, you also want some ventilation along your sides. This will allow more air. Like I said, the more, the better. So, along the side here, I don't know how you're going to see it, but I do have some holes, pretty good sized holes, actually punched in, and it's the whole way around my container, and it's just on the upper rim. I mean, the holes, they're not huge, but they're not really small either. A mealworm is not going to be able to get out of there unless it's a really young baby. But as you can see by the things placed in there, there's no way that a really small little baby mealworm should be able to get up to even get through these holes. And a note on when you're punching holes, I did this with a pocket knife, but you can also use like a wood burner or some kind of hot instrument. But if you're not using a hot instrument to poke your holes, you always want to poke your holes from the inside of the container. So from the inside of the container towards the outside. So you always want to poke this way. You don't want to poke from the outside in. By poking from the inside of the container outwards towards you, the sharper rough edge that may be left by a regular old knife is going to be pointing towards the outside towards you and not towards the mealworms. You might be like, well, I'm just going to feed these mealworms to my pets anyway. Do I really care? You should, because if a beetle would cut itself on a sharp edge, it could break their create a nick or a hole in their exoskeleton, and then they're going to dry out and die. So it's important for maintaining your colony to do that. Like I said, if you're using a hot instrument of some sort, like a wood burner, or you're making something hot and a candle flame to poke these holes, then you can poke from the outside towards the inside, because the hot edge is going to smooth out the entire edge inside and out of that hole. Something else that I did for even more airflow that I haven't seen anyone else do is I actually poked pinprick sized holes that aren't showing up very well in the camera. Let's check this side. Pinprick sized holes. You can kind of see them. I poked pinprick sized holes into every single corner. So all 4 corners, they go up about this high and out about that wide, a little cluster of them. I'm sorry, my camera's not catching this the greatest for you. It's because I'm shaking. But as you might be able to see, these holes go below the level of the oatmeal. So these holes go, there's holes where the oatmeal level is. Right there's one, and there's some. And what this is going to do is by having these holes below the oatmeal line, it's actually going to allow air to get up underneath the middle layer and the underneath layer of the oatmeal and allow air to circulate underneath the oatmeal itself. And this should help prevent any humidity or moisture from getting trapped in the middle or at the middle of the oatmeal or at the very bottom of your container. And, you know, like I said, moisture getting trapped underneath your oatmeal or between the oatmeal is where it's getting caught and it's causing grain mite. So I decided to give this a try, and I just made these by taking a regular old safety pin, or you could even use like a regular, just like clothing pin or whatever. And I opened it up, and then I just held this with a needle nose plier and ran the sharp edge through a candle flame till it was hot, and then just poked it, all these little holes through. And these holes are big and are just small enough that not a lot of the fine pieces of oatmeal or the worm poop really come through. I get a little bit of oatmeal dust that comes through, but it's nothing major. You shouldn't keep your bins anywhere near things that, you know, you're going to be like icked by, you know, having worm poop possibly floating out of your bins. So that pretty much covers my aeration. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, you do need to give your worms a source of water or a moisture source. So for me, I use carrots. A lot of people also like using potatoes or apples. The problem that I find with potatoes or apples is the outside tends to be moister or wetter. And so when you're throwing that in, top of your oatmeal or wheat bran or whatever it is you're using, you're putting moisture right into your oatmeal, right on the oatmeal. It's going to get trapped in the oatmeal and you can get grain mites. So I personally suggest carrots. They don't seem to be nearly as bad. But what I do is I get these baby carrots in the bags. They're already peeled and everything. But, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see this or not, but there is some condensation that builds up along the bottom of the bag and the side and whatnot. So when I take them out, sometimes the outer edge of the carrot has some condensation. It's a little damp. So what I do is I keep a paper towel nearby, and I roll up the carrots in a paper towel, kind of squeeze them, dab it, get all that condensation and the moisture off of the outside of the carrot before I put it into my bin. That way I'm not introducing any extra moisture, water, or anything that does not need to be in here. You can also take, this is a coffee filter. It's a standard old coffee filter. It's all crumpled now, but you can just take a coffee filter and you can crumble it up and put that in the bag with your carrots. And the coffee filter will absorb that condensation or that extra moisture and help hold it away from the body of the carrot, which will also help you keep down the amount of water or condensation or moisture that's going into your bin. If whatever vegetable or whatever that you're giving your worms, as their water source, if you put it in their cage and the oatmeal or the wheat bran sticks to it, that means it's too wet. It's too moist, and you're putting way too much humidity into this bin and just creating perfect conditions for that moisture to build up and let grain mites explode. If you do decide to use carrots or potatoes or apples, I've seen people do it successfully. What I seen somebody do that was great was they actually laid 2 or 3 layers of, actually I think it was more than that, I think it was 4 layers. 4 layers of paper towel across the entire top. So it completely covered their layer of oatmeal that was on the bottom of their bin. And then they set the potato or the apple on the very, very, very top of this 4-layer sheet of paper towel. And the paper towels then absorbed any of the extra water or moisture coming off the potato or the apple, so that that extra moisture never touched the oatmeal at all. And then they would just, change the paper towels every so often to keep humidity out of there. They also, though, they didn't have any kind of top on their bins at all. It was just an open bin like this, which is impractical for most people's homes. I know if I left my bins like this, I'd probably come home and the cats would have them all over the floor. Just do what you need to do. But that is an idea. You could also do a layer of very thin, flimsy cardboard over the top to set the moisture vegetables on. But I personally suggest carrots. They don't tend to be as damp of an outside or anything, but they're nice and moist inside. And I personally suggest the carrots, the full carrots, the whole carrots that aren't skinned or anything. They still have the skin on them, because the ones with the skin tends to lock in that nice, juicy, wet middle, but the outside tends to be pretty dry. So aside from dabbing off condensation with a paper towel, they're really simple, and they have just the perfect amount. And you do change your veggies every day to every other day. When you do change your vegetables, I pick out any dead mealworms that are in here, any dead beetles, or anything like that, because as those dead worms are dying and everything, they start to smell, and they're releasing bodily fluids into the oatmeal, which is going to make it smell, and is introducing, again, more moisture into the oatmeal that can cause grain mites. So try to pick it out every time you change your vegetables. If you have a really big breeding operation, I understand this can be difficult. So about every month you can use a sifter to sift out the dead ones, or every month just do it by hand. Just kind of bear with it. I think it really helps, and it definitely helps on smell, trust me. 2 other things that I do to help with grain mites. Often your grain mites are coming in your oatmeal or your wheat bran. You're getting the dormant eggs, you don't know they're there. And then when your moisture builds up high enough, they explode everywhere. So I actually bake my oatmeal. I sanitize the oatmeal. I bake it to kill off any eggs, grain mite eggs that might be in there. So I just put the oatmeal in like a brownie pan or like a sided cookie sheet, whatever. I lay a really thin layer of the oatmeal down, just enough to completely cover the bottom that you can't see it. And then you bake that in the oven at 250 degrees for at least 10 minutes. And that should kill all or most of your grain mite eggs or anything else icky that might be in there. You can do the same thing if you want to use like wood or bark or leaves or rocks or anything from outside for your reptiles' terrariums. You can do the same thing. You can bake it in the oven at 250 degrees for at least 10 minutes to sanitize it, and that'll kill off most parasites, bacteria, or viruses, most of the common stuff that you're going to get. One person I talked to said they sanitize their things at 250 degrees for the first 10 minutes, and then for 3 to 5 minutes they shoot up the temperature to 350 to kill off a little bit more of your stubborn viruses and whatnot that you might find outside but aren't very common. It's up to you. And a note about heat sanitizing or baking your oatmeal, please do not do it in the microwave. I did this once. I tried it because I was being lazy. But do not just put your oatmeal in a big bowl and then put it in the microwave till it's really hot because it smells bad. And as you're baking it or you're heating it, there's actually moisture that naturally occurs in the kernels of oatmeal or wheat bran. So when you're heating it up like that, a lot of that moisture is getting released. And when it's in a bowl and a thick layer like that, that moisture is actually getting trapped inside in your middle layer of the oatmeal. So even if you're stopping and you're stirring it, you're still getting moisture in there that can't escape, and it does not smell very good. So don't do it. One final note about not getting grain mites is do not put dry kibble or dry pet food into your bins, into your feeder bins. They do it a lot at the pet stores. Don't do it, because one of my really big grain mite problems where it just kept coming back, never had a problem before, keeping all of my conditions and my setup exactly the same. It turns out I kept getting those grain mites because I kept feeding the cats and the dogs and then would just give these guys carrots. And it turns out grain mites and their eggs came inside the bag of cat food. And from the cat food, they went over to the dog food bin and infected that. So I kept putting grain mites and their eggs directly back into my bins. So do not give your mealworms or your superworms dry pet food of any kind. Dry cat food, dog food, hamster food, ferret food, etc. Do not do it. And make sure that you wash your hands between feeding any kind of dry pet food to your other pets. Wash your hands after handling food in the kitchen of any sort, because most things do contain flour or wheat and could potentially carry grain mite eggs. And wash before or after working with your grain mite bins. Wash between anything like that, whether you're going to feed these guys or you were just done taking care of these guys or you just fed your other pets, whatever. Wash and make sure your hands are very dry. You don't want to cross-contaminate and transfer grain mites from one possible source into the other, because all it takes then is getting the right humidity level for them to explode everywhere. All right. As I had mentioned, if you do get grain mites, you pretty much have to kill your entire colony because they're just that hard to get rid of. So you pretty much just want to stick this whole thing in the freezer and freeze them to death. You can feed out some of the worms, some of the beetles, whatever you can immediately to your reptiles, but then you pretty much, they say you just freeze everything and kill it. Throw out everything that's in the bin. That means all the oatmeal, the frozen dead worms, the hide spots, everything. Just throw it out. And then in order to save your bins, you may even want to just throw out your bins and make all brand new ones. But to save your bins, you could soak your bins in a weak solution of Clorox, bleach, and water. So about, just a few drops of bleach to a gallon of water. Just enough that you can barely smell it, but it's not like overly strong. And that'll kill any grain mites and their eggs that are in there. And then again, make sure you bake your oatmeal. You can even pop your hides in the oven to sanitize them before you use them. To get rid of any grain mites are probably going to spread to your stand and everything else around them. So you're actually going to want to move everything out of the room where the problem is into a completely new room. Open up the windows in the room where you had your colonies and spray down the stand, the entire stand, the walls, and all the surrounding carpeting with an actual bug killer, such as something containing permethrin, which is in most bug killers like Hot Shot and Raid. Once it's done drying, fumigate the room. You do not want to bring anything back into that room until the smell of bug spray is gone. So open the windows, put a fan, whatever you need to do. And then I take a wet cloth, like a nice wet damp cloth, and wipe down, like scrub down my entire stand to get off any dried on, like standing bug spray if I use too much. Again, let it fumigate. And then just as another caution, I even take a Lysol or a bleach or a Clorox wet wipe and wipe everything down. I've heard of people putting a ring of Vaseline the whole way around on the outer upper side or bottom or middle, wherever, of their containers to catch any grain mites if you get them, to prevent them from traveling from container to container. I tried this. It did not help me. I still had grain mites in every single container. So I've also heard of setting your bins in a tin foil pan with a little bit of water in it. So you're setting it in a pan of shallow water. Again, that way your grain mites, they can't travel from one bin to the other because they're going to drown. This makes no sense to me, doing this, since grain mites problems are caused by having too much humidity. So I'd rather do the Vaseline thing than set it in a shallow pan of water. I mean, if grain mites are up because you have too much humidity and then you have your bins in a shallow pan of water and the water is evaporating and then that evaporation is right there and can go right into your bin, it makes no sense to do that to me. But people have had success doing that. But bottom line is, unless you're washing your hands every time you go from working in your mealworm bin to working in your superworm bin or whatever, unless you're washing your hands really thoroughly between your two kind of bins, you're going to transfer grain mites from one bin to the other if you get it anyway, even if you have the ring of Vaseline or you're putting these in a shallow pan of water. So it's really up to you.